Fantastic.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. So about 20 years ago, I can't believe it's 20 years already, a paper was published by two economists calling for more empirical evaluation of biodiversity conservation investments. And I think seldom has a single paper had such a big influence on my career, because at the time, I was very interested in biodiversity monitoring methods, and how we could improve the power to detect real change from biodiversity data. And essentially, this paper made reading this paper, I realized that we weren't using monitoring data enough to ask the question, does conservation work? Exactly as Anjali said at the beginning, monitoring isn't enough. Monitoring data doesn't give you the answers you need to know whether your investment is making a difference or not. And the paper also helped me understand that it's actually quite difficult. I don't think I'd quite thought it through before reading that paper, that it can actually quite difficult to tease out whether or not conservation is making a difference or not. But as they pointed out, methods were already out there, but unless we're using them, we'll remain in the dark about the causal effects of our investments. Now, of course, as Bill has said, there's a number of databases, but I'd certainly, flag the conservation evidence database that are out there to synthesize available evidence. And the incredible work the Conservation Evidence Group is doing with AI to really advance the way in which evidence synthesis in conservation can happen is brilliant. But you can only synthesize evidence that is out there. And conservation interventions, of course, are very diverse. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got the kind of interventions where there's quite a direct impact on biodiversity outcomes from the intervention. So if you eradicate rats on an offshore island, that will have a direct impact on seabird breeding success, for example. Or if conservationists are restoring or reintroducing a very rare plant, for example, again, there's a direct impact on the outcomes. But a lot of our interventions, and this is what the chap's question was getting at earlier, there's a much more complex link between the intervention and the outcomes of interest. They're mediated through human behavior. So whether that's conservation protected area rules or incentives through agri-environment schemes or conservation education programs, there's the link between the intervention that you do and the biodiversity outcomes is part of a coupled human natural system with feedbacks between the social and the environmental elements. And we're generally much better at doing impact evaluations for the sort of top end of that spectrum. That's what applied ecology is. But these more human behavior mediated type interventions, they're much more difficult to do evaluations, and consequently we have fewer of them. But across the spectrum, the evidence champions, many of whom are represented in this group, in this room, are doing fantastic work. So over the last couple of decades, there's been what's become referred to as a causal revolution across a number of fields, which is a shift towards using more rigorous methods to understand these cause and effect relationships in the messy real world, such as in these human-mediated conservation interventions. Because at its heart, impact evaluation is a causal inference question. We're asking the question, did the intervention, X, so whatever the intervention might be, did it cause an outcome? And that outcome could be anything: species richness, population size, habitat condition, or in some cases, social outcomes will be relevant here. And I think it's important to just revisit the difference between predictive inference and causal inference. So predictive inference asks the question, if I observe X, will Y happen? And you can build a really good predictive model without any causal variables. So for example, you could predict heathland burning in England by the sale of ice creams, but crucially, you couldn't tackle the problem of heathland burning by banning ice cream vans. Causal inference asks the question, if I do X, will Y happen? Now, most conservationists, particularly traditionally, although that is changing rapidly, have been trained as ecologists. And the tradition there has been very strongly that you cannot demonstrate causation without manipulation. Of course, the grandfather of sort of ecological statistics is R.A. Fisher and his famous quote, "Correlation does not equal causation." But correlation can equal causation. Causal inference says that we can infer causality from correlation with the right assumptions. Assumptions are everything. You can't answer a causal question from data alone, however great your data is. And the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded a few years ago for work in this area for detecting cause and effect relationships from observational data. You'll sometimes hear people say, let the data speak for itself. The data can speak. Data speaks for our implicit assumptions. Data on its own can't answer questions. So if we think about conservation impact evaluation, the most crucial bit of knowledge about your system is how your intervention came to be placed in some locations and not others. So if, for example, you want to know the impact of an agri-environment scheme on an outcome such as populations of lapwings, you can look at sites with and without agri-environment schemes and with and without lapwings, and you could control for anything that you believe affects both why some sites became agri-environment schemes and not others, and that might also affect your outcome of interest. This is a confounder. You can control for confounders. Now, what this study design is assuming is that once you've controlled for those confounders, the allocation of sites in the landscape to either having an agri-environment scheme or not is as random. So if you are analyzing this data and interpreting a causal relationship, that's the assumption you're making. We need to avoid a kind of causal salad, which happens far too often, where essentially you chuck in things into a regression, toss with creative storytelling. But the truth is that however reliable your data, however fancy your data is, however big your data is, that can't turn salad into sense. So what's needed for more and better evaluations of conservation interventions? So number one, a central focus on design over data, while absolutely leaping at the opportunities for new data sources. So as I've said, you cannot overcome the problems of study design with poor data, but the huge expanse of new data sets that are out there now in biodiversity offer incredible potential. So, we're hearing the NCEA data set is incredible. It's bringing together really good citizen science data and eDNA and acoustic monitoring. This is fantastic. Now, a few years ago, when I wrote about this and I wrote about the explosion of the new data, I wrote that these data will only be useful for answering causal questions if we can, if the data collection is designed with causal inference in mind. But as I was writing, I was thinking that's very limiting, because to answer causal questions, we're not going to be designing. We need data that we can then apply to lots of different questions retrospectively to say we want to evaluate the impact of this intervention that happened here. Like there is an explosion now of these kind of studies using remote sensing forest change data because we've got good data on it. But what the real advance and innovation that's happening now that's making me see this completely differently is these geospatial foundation models, particularly Tessera, which I think Anil is going to talk to us about briefly after this, which can essentially act as a glue to interpolate between these rich points where we have good data and we can collect it with these new methods. And that will create layers that allows us to do much, much better causal inference evaluations of policies and practice with a much richer suite of biodiversity outcomes. So it's exciting times, really. We need to embrace new methods. There's conservation has been maybe a bit slow in the uptake on some of these causal inference methods. That was certainly true 5-10 years ago. I wouldn't say it's true now. There's a real movement among early career researchers who are absolutely embracing these kind of methods and throwing themselves into understanding the cutting edge of these methods. And they are hungry to apply it to real conservation challenges. So great partnership potential there. But my final kind of how we do things better is let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good in all of this. And I'm going to just end with an anecdote. So in 2016, the invasive crayfish, the red swamp crayfish, was found on the island of Malta in an important conservation site on the island. And the government moved fast. They got money from the European Regional Development Fund, and they did a really large mechanical eradication program was their plan. So they dredged out the mud from the river, the relevant river, bussed it to a quarry, left it to dry in the sun, and then did a big ecological restoration of that river area. Now, a young Maltese ecologist at the time asked the critical question, well, is this going to work? It cost about $1 million. And crucially, he was thinking, well, will anyone actually learn from this if it turns out to be a waste of effort? He was worried that the project was coming to an end. He was working as a consultant at the time, coming to an end, and he was worried that the crayfish were going to simply reinvade from refuges where the diggers couldn't get to. And soon after that, he started a master's degree with me in Bangor, and he went back out to Malta and sampled crayfish throughout the river extent. And what did he find? Bucket loads of crayfish. Now, in impact evaluation parlance, this is the absolute worst sort of study design. It's a single site after only study. Well, before, after, you could say. There were crayfish there before. They tried to eradicate them. There were still crayfish after. That tells you all that you need to know. The intervention didn't work. And so concerned was Alex by this finding that he decided to look at all of the information for all the funded conservation projects funded under the European Regional Development Programme over a 10-year period. And this represented about 760 million euros. And he found that for the vast, vast majority, well over 95%, there were no evaluations or no information at all in the public domain about what had happened. And of the evaluations that happened, it was a vanishingly few number, and most were after only. And his crucial conclusion from that work is that lessons are being lost, crucial lessons are being lost from that. So my closing thoughts. A causal revolution is absolutely sweeping through conservation policy and practice now. Things are very different. There's huge interest in evaluating the impact of interventions, both in the kind of directed test sort of way, but also learning from messy observational data. If you're interested in this sort of area, the Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual seminar series that I'm currently have the privilege of co-hosting is available, and our back catalogue is all there online with some incredible webinars about the huge diversity of work going on in this area at the moment. And I think there's been a number of shifts in conservation in previous years, in recent years, that have really added to this interest. One, I would say, is private sector involvement in conservation. There's increasing involvement in private sector, and some relevant people are here today. And they really want to know that when they're investing in nature, that those outcomes are delivering what they're expected to deliver. That's been part of it. But, you know, there's a revolution, I would say, in kind of understanding the importance of this. But to deliver it, we need absolutely collaborations between private sector, policymakers, statutory bodies, NGOs, academics, exactly the community that Bill has done such a brilliant job in bringing together today. So thank you, and look forward to getting to know you all better.